Welcome to another episode of Erik with Whiskey Studies, and this is part 2 in our series on Scotch malt whiskey production. And while I'll go over my notes, I'm going to have a little bit of the Mortlach 16-year-old, a whiskey I have already reviewed. Now, in our last video, we looked at barley, its anatomy, and sort of tiptoed into our current topic and on down the line. Each video will have a little bit of layover with the previous and the later videos as we transition from one topic to the next. So, while bourbon whiskey is based on corn, at least 51% minimum, the base grain for Scotch whiskey is malted barley. Irish whiskey can also be made from malt whiskey, but they also uniquely produce pot still Irish whiskey, which is also made with malted barley and non-malted barley. Most Scotch distilleries purchase their malt grain as it is more efficient than owning a malting floor. After the non-barley elements have been removed from the harvested grain with the destoner, the starch in the barley needs to be converted to sugar. This is achieved by initiating the germination process of the grain and then through kilning, stopping the growth of the germinated grain before it uses the sugar to use as a food source to grow a shoot and roots become a new barley plant. The malting process induces physical and biochemical changes in the barley, enabling distillers to utilize the starch within the grain to make alcohol. So you can malt just about any type of grain. You can malt rye, you can malt corn, but barley is the most conducive to malting. And malting some other grains tends to make them clot, sort of bunch up and foam and make quite a mess. So typically, if someone is making a grain whiskey, they're going to use enzymes, either artificially, like in Canada, just add it to the wort, or they're going to use a little bit of malted barley to gain the enzymes for converting the sugar in other grains. The white starch inside the barley is a food source for the barley plant, which enables the grain to germinate and then grow a shoot and roots to become a new barley plant. The starch is held in the endosperm, surrounded by protein, and enclosed in cells, both barriers which need to be breached to allow the distiller to extract the starch. As the embryo starts to grow, it breaks down the entrapping protein and cell walls to access its starch reserve. Step 1. Steeping the barley. The harvested grain has a natural dormancy period, which gives it a resistance to growth during the off-season. Hence, the dormant seed must be tricked into behaving as if it is spring, thus encouraging the barley to germinate and start to grow. The barley is coaxed into growing by a series of immersions in warm water at 16 degrees Celsius, a process known as steeping. Conversely, to store barley for prolonged periods, it must be kept at 15 degrees Celsius at a moisture level below 15% to maintain its dormancy. Steeping raises the grain's moisture content from storage levels at around 12% to 40 to 46%, so initializing growth. Due to the grain's husk being relatively waterproof, simply immersing the grain in water does not quickly raise moisture levels inside the grain. So the steeping process entails a series of wet periods followed by dry periods or air periods. During this process, the grain is immersed in water for a short period to awaken the grain's embryo. Then the water is drained off to allow oxygen to reach the embryo. The now active embryo encourages the grain to absorb more water during the next soak or wet period. Different varieties of barley react to steeping in different ways, so a pattern of wet and dry periods is repeated according to that particular barley variety. A typical steeping pattern might be 7 hours of wet, 10 hours of dry, 9 hours of wet, 7 hours of dry, 7 hours of wet, and 2 hours of dry. This is one of those production issues that's going to vary a lot. Some might be 10 and 14, some might be 4 and 8, and so forth. But you get the general idea that it has to be on and off water. In modern maltings, air is blown through the wet grain during the wet standing periods, and extraction fans remove carbon dioxide during the dry stands. The barley at the bottom of a steep develops slightly slower than at the top. Blowing pressurized air through the barley during wet stands also serves to mix the barley, thus ensuring even development. Once the barley has absorbed enough water and oxygen, the grain will start to germinate and the root, known as a chit, will begin to emerge from the grain, initially visible as a white dot. The growing barley absorbs oxygen and emits carbon dioxide and heat. In order to provide the perfect conditions for the barley to continue to grow, the grain is removed to the next stage of the process, germination. As the barley germinates, a hormone called gibberellic acid activates synthesis of hydrolytic enzymes in the grain's aileron layer, which start to convert the grain's starch and protein reserve, the endosperm, into simpler starches and soluble sugars, the food source that allows initial growth of the germinating embryo, and the shoot, known as the aquosphere, and the root, the chit, begin to develop. The cell walls are broken down during the previously hard-shelled barley to easily crushable malt, allowing the starches to be released during mashing. Your typical sherry notes, dried black fruit notes, a little bit of orange, cinnamon, sort of a chocolate Tootsie Roll, caramel, really, really complex. So if you watched the previous video, you're thinking, didn't we already cover this? Yes. The key to memorization and learning is repetition. And oftentimes I have multiple books on the same subject that write and cover topics from different angles or a little differently to help memorize it. So in our last video, we went more into the anatomy of the barley, but in order to get into malting, we need to recover elements that weren't covered in the previous video. Step 2, barley germination. After steeping, the grain is spread out evenly and encouraged to germinate, that is, it starts to grow. During this period, 4 to 5 days, the maltster will control the humidity, temperature, and airflow, which, along with time, affect the final characteristics of the malt. Now, I just said 4 to 5 days. It depends on the season and whether or not you use the malting floor. At Springbank, when I was there, July 2023, it was 6 to 7 days. But that was summertime. So it all depends on what time of the year and the weather conditions, the climate, and where you're at. The grain must be turned at least twice a day to dissipate the heat produced by the germinating grain, allow carbon dioxide to be released, and to prevent the fine rootlets from becoming intertwined and creating an immovable, thick, matted slab. So on a traditional malting floor, how thick or how deep the barley is depends on the time of the year. In cooler times, you can go a little heavier, and because it's cooler, or at warmer times where you can have all the heat coming out of it, you're going to need a little thinner. So what would happen is if you didn't use a grubber or a turner or a shield, that is the shovel, the barley sitting on top would begin to have roots, and then the roots would then, as they grew, would become intertwined, and you just have one big barley mat. Traditionally, barley is spread on the concrete floors of the malting house to a depth of 15 to 50 centimeters, or 6 to 20 inches, to germinate, with the depth varied to control temperature. This traditional method, termed floor malting, is very labor intensive and relies on back-breaking work of someone first spreading and then hand turning the damp grains using flat wooden shovels called shields. However, most no longer turn the barley by hand, but use one of various machines now readily available. So while you may see a distillery video of someone turning the barley by hand, this may be just for show. The modern machines, some of which are electrically powered, look something akin to a lawnmower, and the entire malting floor can be turned in a matter of minutes. So when I was at Springbank Distillery in July 2023, we used a grubber, which is like a 3-pronged rake, which you pull behind you, and they had a turner, which looks like an electric lawnmower. Historically, each distillery had its own on-site floor maltings, but the distillery's output was restricted by the capacity of its maltings. Floor malting took about a week to complete, so most distilleries now outsource malting to third-party maltsters who use modern mechanized malting methods, which we'll get into later. According to the Maltsters Association of Great Britain, at last count, there are 12 companies, many of which have more than one facility. The 12 malting companies are as follows: Baird's Malt Limited, Bort Malt, Crisp Malting Group Limited, Diageo Scotland Limited, Edwin Tucker and Sons Limited, French and Jups Limited, Highland Distillers, Muntons plc, Simpsons Malt Limited, Soufflet Malt UK Limited, Thomas Fawcett and Sons Limited, and Warminster Maltings. Germination must be checked around about the time the shoot has grown 2/3 of the way around within the husk, and the root is about as long as the grain. If germination is not stopped in time, the grain will become over-modified, meaning that the shoot has used too much of the soluble sugars while growing, leaving little for the yeast to feed on during fermentation. If germination is stopped too soon, the grain will be under-modified, meaning that there is not enough soluble sugar will have been produced in order to produce alcohol. 2 traditional tests allow maltsters to check the development of the grain to assess when to stop germination. One is to check the length of the shoot, the acrosphere, which can be seen growing just under the grain's husk. Another, often preferred by maltsters, is the rub test. The grain's white inner part, that is the endosperm, is exposed by splitting the grain open with the fingernail and the endosperm rubbed between the forefinger and the thumb, or chalk-like down a wall. If no mark is left by the barley, then the starch is still encased within the cell walls and protein, so requires more germination. If a white powder is left, then the germination has reached the optimum stage, having only used around 10% of the available starch, leaving 90% for the distiller. Sweet on entry, a little bit more savory on the back end, but really, really, really rich, which is quite surprising given the ABV level. This is one of those whiskeys that I think, the Mortlach 16, that I think defies the typical low ABV equals, poor whiskey stereotype. I really like the Mortlach 12, and I really like the Mortlach 16. The Mortlach 16 is about $50 more than the Mortlach 12, so bang for the buck, I'd probably buy the Mortlach 12 over the 16, but the 16 is very nice. Old and new malting methods. After malting, the grain superficially resembles the original barley, but is physically and biochemically much changed. Over time, the equipment used by maltsters has become more technically advanced, but the natural changes in the grain induced by malting remain the same. The malt whiskey industry tends towards being traditional with outdated equipment and techniques enduring due to their perceived contributions to flavor and their marketing story. Consequently, the oldest malting technology, floor malting, may be very inefficient and labor-intensive, but not only are floor malting still used, they are being recommissioned. So I've read that Glengarry is bringing back the malt floor. In April 2024, I visited Ardnamurchan, which is a young distillery, and they have a malting floor. So it seems, at least to a certain percentage, malting floors are on the rise in order to provide a distinctive character to the malt, at least perhaps for special bottlings. But it's also a cool thing to look at when you're doing a whiskey distillery tour. In order of technical advance, the 4 main malting methods employed today are 1. Floor maltings, 2. Saladin boxes, 3. Rotary drums, and 4. Germinate and kilning vessels. 1. Floor maltings. Advocates of floor maltings believe that this traditional method allows the grain to retain more flavor from peat smoke in the kiln. Modern mechanized malting methods using warm air dry the grain's husk. In contrast, old-fashioned and slow floor maltings leave the grain's surface moist. It is the surface moisture that the phenols, that is the flavor elements in the peat smoke, stick to during peating. An analogy sometimes used compares a man in a smoky bar wearing a dry sweater with his neighbor whose sweater is damp. When they leave the bar, the man with the damp sweater will have a stronger smell of smoke than the man with the dry sweater. The traditional floor maltings add to a distillery's character, with their long rooms, grain-laden floors, and maltmen using chariots, a wheelbarrow-like tool for spreading barley. When I went through the Springbank Whiskey School, we just used a wheelbarrow. We didn't use a chariot. All very romantic, but floor maltings are inherently inconsistent and very labor-intensive to operate compared to modern mechanized malting methods. Hence, only 9 single malt Scotch whiskey distilleries still operate floor maltings, and most of these buy malt from third-party maltsters, as their own floor maltings are only able to supply a small proportion of their malt requirements. Scottish distilleries with operational floor maltings include Ardnamurchan in the Highlands, Balvenie in Speyside, Ben Riach, which restored their floor in November 2012, Speyside, Bamore on Islay, Glengarry, which also restored their floors in 2021 in the Highlands, Highland Park on Orkney, Kilholman on Islay, Laphroaig on Islay, and Springbank, which produces 100% of their malt used in Campbelltown. Saladin boxes, invented by Frenchman Colonel Charles Saladin in the 1800s, Saladin maltings were the early replacement for floor maltings. There are 2 common designs: Saladin boxes and circular Saladin. Saladin boxes are horizontal boxes fitted with turners that move through the bed several times a day, raising the barley so preventing the rootlets becoming entangled. As the name suggests, circular Saladin are circular vessels fitted with turners attached to an arm that rotates around the vessel. Both designs also allow air to be blown through the barley for cooling. The germinated green malt is then transferred from the Saladin box to the kiln. Saladin boxes can process beds of barley between 60 centimeters and 80 centimeters deep in batches of 200 tons at a time, and generally were made obsolete when drum maltings were introduced. However, Tamdhu Distillery uses a Saladin box. Third, rotary drums. The wet grain is loaded into large drums which immediately revolve to prevent the rootlets from becoming matted. Cool, humid air is blown through the drum to control the heat generated by the grain as it germinates. Once the barley has reached the optimum degree of germination, the grain malt is transferred from the germinating vessels to the kiln. Rotary drums offer a gentle method of producing good quality malt, typically for small production runs. Such drums hold between 9 and 50 tons. The 7 huge Bobby drums, which operate at Port Ellen Maltings on Islay, are the largest malting drums in the Northern Hemisphere and hold 50 tons of barley at its original weight. That is 65 tons of barley at 45% moisture content. The Glen Ord maltings provide many Diageo distilleries with malt, such as Talisker Distillery. The maltings are located next to Glen Ord Distillery near the town of the Muir of Ord. In 1961, the floor maltings were replaced by a Saladin box. In 1968, there was another drum malting added. The Saladin box was disposed in 1983, and today there are only drum maltings. So currently, Glengall Distillery, which is right next door to Springbank Distillery, owned by J&A Mitchell as a Springbank and Cadenhead, relies on Springbank Distillery for their malt, and they also buy malt. I have heard and seen in videos mentioned that Glengall Distillery may be putting in a drum malter, so we'll see how that goes about. If you have the opportunity to visit Speyburn Distillery, as I did in April 2024, they still have the drum malting equipment there, and you can have it explained to you by a whiskey veteran if you do a tour there. So they're not using it, they're not still operational, but for historical purposes they have maintained them, have kept them, and so and you can see the old malting floor. So if you're a whiskey geek and you like studying the history of Scotch whiskey and you want to get a closer look at an older form of malting, definitely do a tour of Speyburn Distillery. For germination and kilning vessels. Germination and kilning vessels, also known as GKVs, are the most modern malting vessels and are operated at Diageo's Rosal Maltings. As the name indicates, these allow the barley to be germinated and kilned in the same vessel. On completion of germination, the humidified air is stopped and replaced with heated air from kiln burners. Step 3. Kilning, stopping the germination of the barley. The means of kilning and type of fuel used will greatly affect a whiskey's character. Heat applied during kilning arrests germination and reduces the water content in the green malt from around 40 to 46% to around 3.56 to 6.5%. Or easier math, from around 45% down to 5%. So, pre-steeping, it's around 12 to 15, then around 45, and then around 5. You want to memorize the moisture contents at the various stages of the barley. Complex chemical reactions also take place during this heating process. Amino acids and sugars are degraded or react together to produce roasted, biscuit-like flavors crucial to the taste of whiskey. The resulting low moisture content also prevents mold growth, so allowing the malted barley to be stored for prolonged periods. During kilning, it is important not to overheat and kill the grain's natural enzymes, which are important in the mashing stage. Kilning takes about 24 to 48 hours. The damp barley is spread across the kiln floor, which has thousands of small holes large enough to let heat, and sometimes smoke, from the heater or fire below rise up through the floor and then to the barley. Traditionally, a distillery's kiln is topped by a chimney with a distinctive pagoda-shaped roof. Such pagoda roofs still crown most Scotch malt whiskey distilleries, although most are now purely decorative. Originally designed by Charles Cree Doig and dubbed the Doig ventilator, these once vented the kilns. In the few remaining distilleries that still malt their own grain, the pagoda sits like a hat atop the outlet from the kiln and serves to create a low pressure area, thus drawing the smoke from the fire through the grain and then out under the pagoda. Springbank, which malts 100% and peats most of the barley, they don't peat for Hazelburn, doesn't have a pagoda. They just sort of have this vent, and the smoke flows out and seems to go into the churchyard next door. The kilning process. There are 4 main phases to modern kilning process. 1. Forced drying, which lasts 3 to 4 hours. Moisture is driven from the interior of the grain. Step 2, the pre-break. This lasts 12 hours. Large volume of air at around 60 degrees Celsius is blown upwards through the bed to drive off moisture from the surface of the grain. 3. Break. This is the point when most of the moisture has been driven off the surface of the grain malt. 4. Curing. Post-break, the temperature is increased and the flow of the air through the bed decreased. In Scotland, particularly on the islands where there are few trees, kilning traditionally used heat from a peat fire, as it was a freely available local fuel. Many of the whiskies produced on the islands, Islay, Arran, Jura, Lewis, Mull, Orkney, and Skye, continue to use malt kilned with peat, although peat is now usually supplemented with more modern fuels such as oil, gas, or anthracite. Coal is no longer used. Peat is decayed vegetation matter and has become partially carbonized, crushed under pressure and adapted by climate. Peat forms in poorly drained wetland conditions from a buildup of partially decomposed vegetation. The constantly wet conditions starve microbes of the oxygen needed to fully decompose the vegetation. Waterlogged dead grass, sphagnum moss, heather, and other plant matter accumulate over thousands of years and are compressed and partially carbonized, not quite coal, to form peat bogs. Parts of the Scottish Highlands and Islands, particularly Islay, have vast tracts of peatland, and the peat differs depending on the vegetation in a particular place. When burnt and used to kiln barley, the smoke emitted by peat cut from bogs in Islay imparts very different flavors to the barley than the peat cut from the Scottish mainland. The seaweed, tar, and iodine, so typical of Islay malts, are partly due to decomposed marine vegetation and sea salt in the island's peat. The peat on the Orkney Islands is composed almost entirely of heather, so imparts Orcadian malts with a heathery, gentian-like smokiness. Highland peat varies again according to location, but contains more tree lignin, so it lends to impart a more wood fire-like smokiness. The longer the malt is exposed to peating, the peatier the whiskey will be. Peat smoke is more easily absorbed by the green malt when the surface is still wet, so peat is burned at the start of kilning prior to the point known as the break. Chemicals known as phenols, which contain isometric creosols, guaiacol, and xylenols in the peat, smoke flavor the malted barley and subsequently the whiskey. Typical flavors imparted by peat smoke phenols include vegetal, medicinal, carbonic, tar, creosote, clove, seaweed, and even a little bit of pepper. The amount of peatiness, or peat reek, of malted barley is measured and expressed in parts per million, that is ppm, of phenols, the flavor element imparted by the peat smoke. Each distillery specifies a specific peat level to be supplied by its maltster. Traditionally, distilleries on Scotland's west coast use more peat reek than those in Speyside and the east coast. However, aging a whiskey tends to reduce the impact of the peat as it becomes more integrated into the whiskey. So, if you like a strong peat forward whiskey, you may prefer a younger, that is 10 to 12 years, rather than an older whiskey, say 20 plus years. Peat malt levels. Level of phenols expressed as parts per million. A very heavily peated whiskey is considered to be 50 ppm to 170 ppm. Bruichladdich Octomore uses as much as 167 ppm. Heavily peated is 30 to 50 ppm. Ardbeg uses around 50 to 55 ppm. Moderately high is considered 20 to 30 ppm. Lagavulin uses around 30 ppm. Medium peated is around 15 to 20 ppm. Talisker and Highland Park use around 20 ppm. Moderate low is 5 to 15 ppm. Lightly peated is 1 to 5 ppm, which is typical of Speyside's malts, which use around 2 ppm. And unpeated or unpeated malts that can have phenolics of 0.6 to 0.8 ppm. While it is easy to accurately measure how phenolic malt is, it is more challenging to accurately peat malt to a specific level. Peating levels vary by 5 to 10%, so it is easier for maltsters to consistently make heavily peated malt, and for maltsters or distillers requiring medium peat levels to blend heavily peated malt with unpeated malt to dependably achieve their desired medium peat levels. So, rather than trying to get exact ppm levels if you want a medium or low level of peat, rather than try to just be that on target with your peating level, you can just do a heavily peated malt and then take an unpeated malt and then blend the two spirits to the degree that you want your ppm levels. Harvesting peat. The use of dried peat as a fuel in Scotland dates back to medieval times when the Little Ice Age left few trees in Scottish Highlands. The surface turf above the peat is cut away with a peat spade. A tool called a tares gear or fowl or peat iron is then used to cut and extract the peat itself in long bricks. A long-handled three-pronged fork is then used to haul peat bricks up from the wet trench onto the bank where they are spread out to dry. After being left to dry for a few weeks in good weather, the peats will be dry enough to be stood on end without collapsing. This step is called lifting, and the peat bricks are lined up to further dry for 4 to 6 weeks, resting on each other in a line called a Rudhan. The hand cutting of peat is a dying art, and most commercially cut peat is now dug out by machines, which cut in a chainsaw-like action to produce sausage-shaped peat rather than traditional bricks. Peat is cut into 3 types. The top level can be crumbled like dry leaves. This burns quickest but produces lots of smoke. The next level is dried mud and produces less smoke but more heat. And finally, the bottom layer, which is called moss, looks like chocolate brownies when wet and coal when dried. Peat is cut in spring, left to dry over summer, and then moved to the distillery in autumn with enough cut to last the entire year. So a little bit of overlap with our previous video, but going much more in depth, getting a little nerdier here. So if you visit a distillery and you do a tour, distillery guides don't want to overwhelm tourists and give them too much information. So what I'm trying to do is provide more information here than what you're typically going to hear if doing a distillery tour. At the time of the recording of this video, I've been to 49 distilleries in Scotland, as far north as Orkney, as far west as Ardnamurchan, as far east as Glengarry, as far south as Annandale and Bladnoch. Been to Islay twice and Arran, and I've heard a lot of different ways of explaining things in a distillery, and for the most part, they have to keep things sort of basic. So I'm hoping this video series is much more supplemental, provide a lot more information into your appreciation and understanding of the production of Scotch whiskey. All right, if you've not already, please like, subscribe, and if you have any comments or questions, leave them down below. Until next time, Slàinte. Hey, don't forget to subscribe and check out these other whiskey videos.